Too. That, cost of living and defence policy all this morning on The Briefing. Stay tuned, but first, it's your morning headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:34. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has reportedly been hit by the resignation of a fifth advisor just hours after 4 key aides quit last night. Conservative Home Editor Paul Goodman claims that Eleanor Narazansky has left her role as a special advisor in the policy unit. Yesterday, Boris Johnson lost his Chief of Staff, Principal Private Secretary, Director of Communications and Policy Chief. The Conservatives have won the Southend West by-election, prompted by the killing of Sir David Amess. The other major parties, Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, chose not to stand. That paved the way for Tory candidate Anna Firth to gain 86% of the vote. The Foreign Secretary is condemning reports that Russia is planning to fabricate an attack by Ukraine, giving President Vladimir Putin an excuse to invade. US reports claim Moscow planned to use a fake video of a Ukrainian military attack on Russian speakers. Stormont has lost its governing powers after DUP First Minister Paul Givan stepped down over the post-Brexit agreement. He claims the Northern Ireland Protocol is destabilising peace between the power-sharing institutions. Hundreds of job centres and youth hubs have opened up across Britain in a bid to help employment. The government says the 300 new and extended venues will help get 500,000 people into work by the end of June. The opening ceremony for the Winter Olympics begins in just under 2 hours' time at the Bird's Nest Stadium in Beijing. Due to COVID-19, the Games will take place inside a so-called closed loop, with competitors kept away from the public and only small audiences. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:36 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV, your radio and online. Now, Number 10 was rocked last night by the resignation of Munira Mirza, a long-standing aide to the Prime Minister, by his side for 14 years. Her exit is undoubtedly a devastating blow for the PM. It was followed last night by 3 more. Comms Chief Jack Doyle is out, Chief of Staff Dan Rosenfield is out too, and Martin Reynolds, the Prime Minister's Principal Private Secretary who sent that infamous "bring your own booze" email, he's out as well. While these resignations were surely inevitable, the speed at which they've come has surely raised eyebrows, particularly as no replacements for those final 3 have yet been announced. It all feels a little bit rushed, despite Number 10's claims of this being the plan all along. And this morning, the Conservative Home website revealed one further resignation. Number 10 Policy Unit member Eleanor Narazansky. Well, she's out too. Well, let's discuss all of this now with the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, who, of course, was one of the first to publicly call upon Boris Johnson to resign. Andrew, today and last night, a lot of your colleagues have been saying that this is the kind of action that the Prime Minister promised on Monday when he said there should be changes in Downing Street. I'm guessing that's not your view.
Well, that depends if you think that the Prime Minister was the instigator of these resignations or they're unplanned. To me, if it's not Number 10 in meltdown, it certainly would appear to be in crisis. I don't think all of those resignations were planned by Number 10. Ultimately, now I think is the time for Cabinet Ministers to show some leadership and go and tell Boris that the writing is not on the wall, it's on the wall in capital letters, and it's been there for quite some time. People who want to be leaders, leaders don't run away from trouble, they confront it and get it sorted, and that's what the Cabinet needs to do now. Well, certainly if they think they're going to come and lobby me for support at the future leadership election, that is.
It's interesting, given that a lot of the criticism around this number 10 has been the policy direction, the net zero targets, the tax rises, the relatively unconservative agenda that so many people have described this Conservative government as pursuing. Does it not make sense, therefore, that some of the policy unit should change, that some of the people who are around the Prime Minister should go?
You're absolutely right on policy. I've struggled to vote with the government. I'm an old-fashioned, middle-of-the-road Thatcherite. I first joined the party when I was at university in the 80s. And I've not voted for the national insurance increases. I didn't vote for the debacle over Owen Paterson. I voted against Plan B. I've been very, very disappointed. But ultimately, advisors advise, ministers decide, and ultimately Boris Johnson placed all these people in positions of power in number 10, and really, quite honestly, the buck stops with him. I do wonder how many of those individuals who resigned, which certainly some of them we know, will have to be questioned over the 12 gatherings or parties that were held in number 10 during the lockdown, and whether this is a convenient reason for them to leave.
Yes, I think that does seem to be the reason behind some of these exits, particularly some of those people who are already in the public domain as having held parties or been at parties or indeed invited people to parties over the last 2 years under various forms of restriction.
And clearly, Tom, the bring your own bottle by Mr. Reynolds, that was so there was no paper trail for the drinks bill, which would have been inexplicable. I mean, that is almost an indication of the fact that they knew it was against the rules and they didn't want to be found out about it. That's inexcusable in my view.
It's pretty extraordinary, given that when that email was sent, allegedly some advisors within number 10, not least of all Dominic Cummings, raised concerns about this being an event against the rules, although it is an open question as to how much the Prime Minister would be doing his own personal emails, about whether he would have seen such an invite. I think there is an argument here, is there not, that some of these senior civil servants who are operating relatively independently a lot of the time, they are at fault here, not just the Prime Minister.
Of course they are, but ultimately the Prime Minister recruited them. The Prime Minister is the head of number 10, the head of the government, and he sets the culture. He would have known what the culture was. And Tom, I had huge policy disagreements with Theresa May, as you're well aware, while she was Prime Minister, mainly over Brexit. I never once, though, questioned her integrity. Do any of your viewers think that any of these shenanigans would have gone on in the same circumstances if Theresa May had been Prime Minister? I don't for 1 minute. Therefore, that's a huge culture change in number 10 under Boris Johnson. And again, the buck stops with Boris. He can sack who he wants, but he appointed them all and he's allowed the culture to develop.
I suppose just finally in this conversation, we do need to mention the reason that that was given on that resignation letter just yesterday afternoon, wasn't it? It was the idea that the Prime Minister was going too far in raising the Jimmy Savile case with Keir Starmer. You're arguing there that the buck stops with the Prime Minister in number 10. Is it not also fair to say that the buck at the CPS stops with the leader of the CPS?
Well, I personally think that using Boris's remarks about Jimmy Savile and Keir Starmer, I think that's a bit of a smoke screen to allow people to escape from number 10 with some honour. I don't think it covers them in any glory. Personally, I think Keir Starmer does have issues to answer with regard to not bringing charges against Jimmy Savile. I think he apologised in 2013 to the Levitt Review. 3 times they had an opportunity to bring Jimmy Savile to court for allegations, and they failed to do so. He wouldn't have have made that apology if he wasn't in some way responsible. He was the head of the organisation that failed to act. So I think the problem with the Prime Minister and the Savile allegation against Starmer is it just looked desperate because the Prime Minister himself was in trouble. I think it was the timing of that. I don't think it actually detracts from the fact that, by his own admission, Keir Starmer needs to take some responsibility.
Well, Andrew Bridgen, we appreciate your thoughts this morning. Always good to have you on the programme. Thank you for joining us on The Briefing on GB News. Well, something we mentioned there was policy. And with living standards dropping, inflation rising and the state taxing and spending, things are all starting to look a little bit like the bad old days of the 1970s. Well, what can be done about all of that? With me now is Christopher Snowden, the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme, Chris. First of all, should we have seen inflation coming? The Bank of England suggesting that inflation will peak at over 7% now. Should we have seen it coming?
Yes, and a lot of us did see it coming. We at the Institute of Economic Affairs have been warning about this for 18 months. It's not really rocket science. If you pump the amount of printed money into the system that we have done in the last 2 years because of COVID-19, it's very, very likely that you're going to see inflation. It's not quite as simple as saying that money printing always creates inflation. You know, it's printing too much money that creates inflation, and it seems that we have printed far too much money, as indeed they have in the USA, where inflation is already 7%. So I think 7% here is a perfectly reasonable prediction, but no one really knows. And no one knows whether it's going to be transitory or not. But no, as recently as last May, the Bank of England was still saying that we were looking at around about 2% inflation for the foreseeable future, by which I meant like the next 2 or 3 years. So they got it disastrously wrong. I don't know why. It seems to me the Bank of England isn't that bothered about inflation. But yeah, lots of people saw it coming.
It is extraordinary that responding to these inflationary pressures, particularly around energy bills, as we heard from the Chancellor yesterday, is yet more state spending. Billions of loans to energy companies, money given to councils to give people rebates as well. Is the answer to inflation, is this a counterproductive measure? Spending more through the state to try and combat rising prices? Surely that's just a horrible spiral that we could enter into.
Yes, it doesn't make any sense, because this is largely, but not entirely, a problem of the government's own doing. The government has been really effectively trying to push up energy prices in its efforts to combat climate change. We could be using the gas from under the ground in Britain, but they've effectively banned fracking. We could be using nuclear power, but there was a decision made effectively many years ago not to build very many nuclear power stations and to let the ones that we have got be dismantled. So we have high energy prices for a number of reasons that directly result of government policy. And now the policy is to try and patch over that rather than try and bring the cost down, is to give people money. Where's that money going to come from? It'll certainly be borrowed, if not printed. You know, last month alone, we borrowed £17 billion, of which £8 billion was interest on the debt. So, you know, it was always a myth that this was cheap money. The interest payments are high, and they're going to get higher, and they're going to need at some point to, in fact, they already are talking about and introducing new taxes. But, you know, the tax take is going to go up unless the government gets a grip on this.
It seems like we're living through an extraordinary period of political consensus. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor not being that far away from the Labour Party in terms of their ideas of higher taxes and more state spending in order to combat the problems that we're seeing. Is there any chance, finally, in this conversation, of a change of political culture around these questions?
Well, to some extent, it's what people want. I mean, I'm one of the tiny minority of people who think that the NHS is an overpriced killing machine and should be dismantled and privatised. But the vast majority of the population don't think that at all. They think the NHS is absolutely wonderful. And the only problem with it is it needs more money. Well, it's getting more money. It's had more money. It's got a lot more money now, but that has got to be paid for. So given that we've surely reached the limits of how much more money we can print, and we're already seeing the inflationary effects of that, it makes sense that if people want to spend more on the NHS, they're going to have to pay for it. So we've got a tax coming in now in April that will have an effect on people's cost of living, but they'll get what they want for. They're outside clapping for this overrated institution. They wanted more money for it. They've got to pay for it.
Well, Chris Snowden, it's a view. It's a view. I'm not sure that many people watching would necessarily agree that the NHS could be dismantled. Perhaps it could be a lot more efficient. But thank you anyway for your contribution there. It is an extraordinary situation that we're living through. And you're quite right that the Institute of Economic Affairs was much better than the Bank of England at seeing this inflationary trap coming down the road. Chris Snowden, thank you for joining us. Well, moving to Northern Ireland now, where yesterday another seismic announcement took place. The resignation of First Minister Paul Givan over Brexit checks in the Irish Sea. But what happens now? Well, joining me to discuss this is none other than GB News presenter and former First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster. Who better to talk us through the situation of the resignation of a First Minister?
Yes, of course, we've been here before. In 2017, we had the resignation of the then Deputy First Minister, and once either of those places resign, the other one goes automatically as well because it's a joint office. And so when Paul Givan resigned yesterday, Michelle O'Neill is also out of office at the same time.
It's interesting, though, because I understand there is a piece of legislation going through Parliament right now, not yet receiving royal assent, potentially receiving royal assent next week, that would mean that there wouldn't be a collapse in the executive once this piece of legislation receives royal assent. It can be retrospective as well. So potentially this resignation is not going to bring down the Northern Irish government.
Yes, that legislation was put in place after New Decade, New Approach, which was the agreement that brought us back in 2020 to government again. It hasn't finished its process in the House of Commons, as you rightly say. But I think this is much wider than that, to be honest, Tom. What you're seeing here is the outworkings of a DUP strategy, which was announced last year, that if the protocol was not dealt with by the UK government, then the DUP would have to take action in the Northern Ireland Assembly. That was laid out in September in quite a long speech from their leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. And what you're seeing now is the outworkings of that, because he said to the Prime Minister in October of last year, we need to get this sorted. The PM apparently, according to Sir Geoffrey, told him that we'll have 3 weeks of intensive talks and then we'll move. Of course, we all know that that didn't happen. We're still in those negotiations with the EU and the UK. So Sir Geoffrey decided enough was enough.
And I think it's important now to talk about exactly what this protocol is doing to Northern Ireland. The fact that all of these lorries that are bringing in the same food that they were bringing in before Brexit have to be sort of performatively checked as if it's a sort of act of theatrics, because they're not going to find anything in these checks, are they? No,
nothing at all, because of course the regulations are exactly the same in GB as they are in the EU at this present moment in time. The protocol was put in place for two reasons. One was to protect the Belfast Agreement. Of course, it's not doing that because we've seen the institutions now in real crisis. And the second was to protect the single market of the European Union from any outside influence, lower regulations that would bring some problem into the single market. Of course, the way in which they've been doing it is completely disproportionate to the risk. There is no risk to health in the single market because of food that comes into Northern Ireland and may just slip across the border into the Republic of Ireland. It's completely nonsense. But the European Union are a very legalistic organisation, as you know, and that protocol was agreed, and they are pushing it to the nth degree, even though there is no risk.
To me, it's extraordinary, given that the European Union, for the best part of 3 years, emphasised the fragility of the peace process in Northern Ireland, emphasised how this was a situation that needed the utmost political care. And then as soon as they got the agreement, or the agreement particularly in the case of Northern Ireland, that they wanted, suddenly there seems to be no care, suddenly there seems to be no delicacy of application, and they're going for the most legalistic, most brutal application of this agreement possible. Yeah,
it's almost as if the majority community don't matter from Northern Ireland. I mean, there's not one single unionist representative in favour of this protocol, and yet they've completely ignored that. They say that they're listening, but actually unionists feel as if they're crying in the wind, and they haven't been listened to by the European Union. They had hoped that the UK government would listen to them. We've heard the Prime Minister describe the protocol just last week as insane, and that the EU were pettifogging in the way that they were implementing the protocol. But of course the PM could act. He could trigger Article 16 of the protocol and he could act unilaterally, but he's chosen not to do that.
It's interesting, speaking to the Prime Minister's spokesman yesterday, saying that the view of Number 10 is that this is a matter for Northern Ireland. The suspension of checks is decreed by the Agriculture Minister in Northern Ireland. Those checks are still going ahead, though, even though Number 10 is trying to wash its hands of it, saying nothing to do with us, this is a matter for the Northern Ireland Executive. How on earth does this get resolved if Number 10 doesn't want to get involved?
Well, of course, the UK government is a sovereign government of the entirety of the United Kingdom. It is they that have the agreement with the European Union, so it is up to them now as to what happens in the internal market of their own country. And that's the key. I mean, this is about the union. And actually, in a court in Belfast a couple of months ago, the judge was saying that actually this had changed the Act of Union insofar as the free trade movement internally within the UK had been disrupted by the protocol. So therefore, we need to see action taken by our own government to deal with that. Up until now, unfortunately, they haven't taken that action, and that has forced the hand of the DUP to do what they have done. And I really regret that, because the institutions are now in crisis yet again, and that's not good for the people of Northern Ireland, Tom.
And of course, just in the last 45 seconds of the programme, there are elections coming up in May. What's your preview?
Well, there's some talk now of wanting the election sooner than May, to have them in March, because there's no point having what some people are calling a zombie assembly taking place whilst the executive is not in place. It's not a zombie assembly, of course, because the legislation is still going through. It'll be a very tough election. It'll be a very polarised election. And I think the people of Northern Ireland will be very concerned about that.
Well, Arlene Foster, thank you very much for running us through those issues, very important issues for an important part of our country. Coming up, it's To The Point with Inaya Florin Iman and me. I'll be presenting the next programme as well, so enjoy that for the next 2 hours. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning. It's colder out there today, cold enough for some snow and ice in places as well. A cold front has moved across the country through the night, bringing a spell of heavy rain and gusty winds, and it is sweeping away the mild air that's been in place for the past few days, introducing much colder air with a cold feel to it because of the wind, particularly across Scotland. It's not completely cleared away yet. The rain is still across the southeast and East Anglia. A bit of snow in places as well before that scoots away by lunchtime. Sunnier skies follow, but so do the showers. Icy this morning across Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, where we've got plenty of showers that keep going through the day. Snow on the hills, but even to low levels. Sleet and snow likely at times across Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, Northwest England, maybe North Wales. A few wintry showers possible further south. Temperatures struggling, single figures below average. Add on that wind, it feels much closer to freezing. The showers will keep going across the northwest of England, Western Scotland through the evening. So again, it could turn icy as temperatures tumble, but then temperatures starting to rise in the north through the night as more cloud and rain moves in. That could bring some snow to parts of Scotland again on Saturday morning. It will be a cold night again with a touch of frost even in towns and cities, certainly in rural areas across the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast to start the weekend. But we should start here with some sunny spells. Generally quite a grey day though on Saturday, a damp day for Scotland. As I said, some snow for a time. Damp and drizzly too for Northern Ireland, Northwest England and much of Wales by the afternoon. Not much rain getting to the south or the east of England. It will be milder, temperatures back up to double figures in places, but it's still going to be windy, and the colder air will return to northern Scotland and spread more widely across the north on Sunday. So Sunday sees some damp weather across the south, wintry showers across the north, and again, for all of us, it's going to be pretty blustery.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?